Mr Flello, this festive period, hundreds of thousands of British citizens will be travelling home to their families or going on holiday for a break. You'd expect such a trip to be uneventful. Why would anything go wrong? For some British citizens, however, what happened while they were travelling abroad has turned their lives upside down in a way many of us couldn't begin to comprehend. Two prompt examples of this are Andy Tsegi and Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. Both are British, a dual national in Nazanin's case, who were arrested by foreign authorities and imprisoned without access to a fair trial. Andy was kidnapped by Ethiopian agents in Sana's international airport in Yemen, with the Yemeni authorities stating that his detention had not occurred pursuant to any judicial process, whilst Nazanin and her 2-year-old daughter were arrested whilst leaving Iran. The ordeal both have since faced is truly shocking, and on top of the injustice of their detention, their daily lives have been subjected to gross human rights violations. In the time permitted, Mr Fellow, I will concentrate on these two cases. A longer debate would, of course, have allowed the cases of prisoners of conscience of all nationalities around the world to be raised, and many organisations have contacted me since this debate was permitted, to draw attention to, for instance, Ali Al-Nim, who is spending his 22nd birthday in prison in Saudi Arabia. And what were his crimes? Well, participating in a demonstration and also apparently explaining how to give first aid to protesters and using his BlackBerry to invite others to join him at the protest. Or indeed the case of Nabil Rajab, whose trial has been delayed for the 5th time and is expected to be sentenced on the 28th of December, perhaps a diversionary tactic when perhaps the attention won't be on his case as festive celebrations get underway. And he's a Bahraini human rights activist, an opposition leader, and of course that is a case of particular interest to the UK because of the funding from the UK that is going into training and supporting the security and justice systems in Bahrain. And of course there is a case that was drawn to my attention just yesterday about someone detained in Israel who is in fact a dual UK-Lebanese citizen, Mr Faiz Mahmoud Ahmed Shirari, whose release has been ordered by a military court in Israel, but as far as I'm aware, he has not to date been released. And finally, I would also like to use this opportunity to raise the case of the Ahmadi Muslim community. I know many members here today have raised their concerns about the pressures that community are under in different countries around the world, but perhaps most prominently in Pakistan, but also, I understand, in Algeria. But to bring it to the debate to the focus of what I want to concentrate my comments on, that is Andy. So Andy, this will be the 3rd Christmas he has spent alone in a prison, now in a prison notorious for being Ethiopia's gulag. He has not been able to speak to his partner and children in London for 2 years and has had no private consular access from British officials, leaving him unable to describe freely the treatment he's received at the hands of his jailers. Whereas Nazanin has been held mostly in solitary confinement for over 9 months. Her husband, who's campaigned tirelessly back in London for the UK government's call for her release. It's still unclear, and I hope that perhaps when the Minister responds he'll be able to clarify this, whether in fact the government have done this. Have they actually called for her release? Her husband says, and we know that she has been at breaking point. She's currently only allowed to see her daughter for 1 hour each week in prison. Her daughter remains trapped in Iran, unable to see her father. Further, representatives for both Andy and Nazanin have repeatedly raised serious concerns for their health. I'm happy to give way.
He made an excellent speech, and he mentions this point of what our government has done. In the case of Andy Tsegi, I think it's not in dispute that he was rendered unlawfully, and he was tried in absentia. And we would not recognise any of those processes. Does the Honourable Gentleman think it's extraordinary that the government has not, therefore, even requested his release?
I do indeed, and what the government have or are trying to initiate, apparently, which I will come on shortly, is providing him with a lawyer. But as I understand it, Andy Tsegi has no right of appeal in Ethiopia, and therefore providing him with a lawyer doesn't seem to be of great use. So, Mr. Fellow, the mistreatment of British citizens imprisoned abroad is unacceptable in all cases, regardless of what crime has been committed. Yet, in these cases, the astounding truth is that it is clear that Andy and Nazanin are being held unlawfully. Attached to Andy's name was a conviction and death sentence after a trial in absentia, as we've just heard, which was condemned throughout the world. Whilst Andy was previously prominent in Ethiopian politics, no country other than Ethiopia have found evidence at the time of his kidnapping that the political organisation which he was involved with conspired to commit acts of terrorism. Nazanin was recently sentenced on charges which remain secret, despite her previous employment within Iran as an aid worker. The simple fact is that these British citizens are not going to be, if they are not going to be charged with an offence recognised internationally, they should be released immediately so they can spend Christmas at home safe with their families, who all want more, who want nothing more than for them to be able to spend time at homes and for their lives to return to normality. Yesterday, Reprieve and I met the Ethiopian ambassador about Andy's case, and we're grateful to His Excellency and his Minister for Public Diplomacy for their time. We are aware that last Thursday, on the 15th, Andy received a consular visit. Like all the other consular visits, however, this was supervised by the prison authorities. As I stated earlier, Andy has never met consular officials in private. During the visit, we understand that the UK ambassador told Andy that the UK may have found a lawyer to help Andy assess his options under the Ethiopian legal system. Unfortunately, this is not, in my view, a demonstration of progress on his case. Firstly, the UK government's approach to this case appears to ignore the fact that Andy is the victim of a series of crimes and not a criminal. The UK government's failure to condemn the series of abuses that Andy has suffered and continues to suffer at the hands of the Ethiopian regime signals that foreign governments can ignore international law and kidnap British citizens at will. I'm happy to give way.
To the honourable member for giving way, I declare an interest as chairman of the all-party Ethiopia group. The honourable member has repeatedly referred to Mr Segi's kidnapping. Does he have any evidence that it was a kidnapping? Does he have any statements provided by the Yemeni government to that extent? Because that is not what the Ethiopians are saying. Obviously, if he does have that evidence, I'm happy to help him with the case as far as that goes.
Well, what I would say in response to that intervention is that my understanding is that the Yemenis have stated that the process of getting Mr Tsegi from Yemen to Ethiopia did not follow a judicial process that they recognised. Furthermore, as he may be aware, the UK government have repeatedly asked for a copy of the extradition treaty that apparently exists between Yemen and Ethiopia, and as far as I'm aware, that has not been provided. So I hope that that might provide sufficient evidence for him to want to investigate the matter further. Further, the UK government's strategy of focusing on access to a lawyer in this case is unworkable for a number of practical reasons. There is no legal conviction and sentence to appeal. Andy was convicted and sentenced to death illegally in 2009 while he was living in London with his family. The trial was described by a representative from the US Embassy in Addis Ababa as a political retaliation and lacking in basic elements of due process. Andy was, I maintain, abducted in 2014 amid a sweeping crackdown on opposition voices. There was no lawful basis for Andy's rendition from Yemen to Ethiopia, and Andy has not been charged with any new offence. I'm happy to give way.
I appreciate the honourable member giving way. And does the honourable member agree with me that UK governments, this government and previous governments, have been too slow to criticise rendition, especially when rendition has been on British Indian Ocean territory?
I agree entirely with the Honourable Lady in terms of her intervention. I think rendition and the UK's involvement in it is a very black mark on our past, and I hope it's something that is not, that the UK government will fight at every opportunity now, including in this particular case. I'm happy to give way.
I congratulate the honourable gentleman for having this debate. I'm slightly confused by this. Does the Yemeni government accept that it knew that it was being removed from its territory? Or does it say it was done secretly without its knowledge?
Well, at the risk of repeating myself, I think the information I have had is that the Yemeni authorities, clearly they know that he was taken from there. They have stated that they believe that there was no judicial process that had been followed to extract him in that way, which would sort of imply that if there was an extradition treaty in place between Yemen and Ethiopia, that it wasn't actually used as a means of extracting him from that country. But maybe the Minister, when he responds, can give us some more detail on what he believes to be the position. Had the Ethiopian government wanted to extradite Andy... Yes, I'm happy to wait. Yeah.
So, Mr. Fair, the Honourable Gentleman is being very, very generous in giving way and is laying out his case very carefully and very strongly, and I congratulate him on bringing this important debate. Can I just pursue this question, though, because he's already stated that Mr. Sege may quite possibly have been the victim of a crime, or several crimes, and if there was no judicial process applied in the rendition from the airport in Yemen, does that imply there could have been an official but non-judicial process, i.e. could there have been some sort of official complicity amongst Yemeni authorities as well, and in which case should we be aiming fire at potentially them having committed crimes against Mr. Sege as well?
Well, again, I think that's a very helpful intervention, and he, I think, has highlighted perhaps an area that does require pursuing, because I think when we had the meeting with the Ethiopian ambassador yesterday, what he implied was that in the past there have been arrangements between the Yemenis and the Ethiopians, and maybe it was those arrangements, perhaps, that were used as opposed to there being a formal extradition process. But yes, that may well be the involvement of the Yemeni authorities may also be something that we want to question. But certainly what is clear is that had the Ethiopian government wanted to extradite Andy lawfully, they could have made a request for his extradition to the UK authorities, although I understand there is no formal extradition agreement currently between the UK and Ethiopia. But I believe no such request was made, and as far as I'm aware, the UK government have been provided with no evidence of Andy's so-called terrorist activities. What I understand the UK government are being encouraged to do, apparently, is to follow the trial, the open, this is the description from the Ethiopian ambassador, the open trial process that which found Andy guilty in absentia as their means of obtaining information rather than perhaps necessarily expecting it from the Ethiopian government directly. So the Ethiopian government have publicly confirmed on a number of occasions that there are no legal options open to Andy, most recently in the meeting yesterday that I've just referred to, which confirmed that he cannot appeal his sentence because he was absent from his trial. A plea for clemency may be possible to the Ethiopian president, and I look forward to some information that we were offered at that meeting about how exactly such a plea could be initiated. So I maintain that access to a lawyer will not achieve justice for Andy by continuing to pursue what I think is an unworkable strategy. The UK government is not living up to its duty to protect British citizens facing the death penalty overseas. Now, on that point, we got a degree of reassurance from the Ethiopian ambassador that the Ethiopia does not apply capital punishment, although he did set out a couple of exceptions to the rule about them not applying capital punishment. So that it was sort of half reassuring and half not. Andy's most recent consular visit also highlighted continued failures by the FCO in handling his case. So, for instance, whilst the FCO have continuously claimed and represented to a UK court that Andy could call his partner and children whenever he wanted to, the prison director informed the ambassador at the latest visit that prisoners cannot make phone calls. And this was confirmed in the meeting with the Ethiopian ambassador yesterday too. Thus, Andy is not, and as far as I'm aware, never was able to call his family, so his children face the third Christmas in a row without any contact with their father. And he does not even have a pen and paper to write them a Christmas card. So given the, what I consider to be fairly significant failures in this case and the way it's been managed, I hope the Minister will be willing to conduct a meaningful review of the government's approach, because I don't think the approach is delivering. So what more can be done to help Andy and Nazanin? So whilst hundreds of thousands of people have supported petitions and campaigns in partnership with the tireless work, the tireless advocacy work of groups such as Reprieve and Amnesty, ultimately, of course, it is the Ethiopian, Iranian and our government which have the most influence and leverage. So to the Ethiopian authorities, I would say a simple plea, let Andy make that call before Christmas. 2 years without contact with his wife or children, that can stop very easily if the Ethiopian authorities permit it. And for the Iranian authorities, again, pending Nazanin's release, which I hope will be soon, allow for visits for her young daughter involving extended contact and in a suitable environment, taking account of the best interests of the child in line with the provisions of the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, which I'm pleased Iran has ratified. There is not time, Mr. Flello, to raise in any detail the case of Kamal Faroughi, but I hope that perhaps other members may want to refer to his case as well. So what should the UK government do at this point? Well, I think they need to call openly and loudly for Iran and Ethiopia to free Nazanin and Andy respectively. I believe the weight of the Prime Minister calling for their release would be significant and set a strong tone, and the tone would be the UK does not stand by and let their citizens face appalling treatment, trapped in prisons thousands of miles from their homes. And we have seen the US and Canada and the UK previously secure the release of their citizens after publicly raising calls for the release of their nationals imprisoned unlawfully abroad. Yet it would appear that the UK government appears reluctant to do the same. The FCO stress the work they do for the families of Andy and Nazanin and say they repeatedly raise these cases with the respective governments. However, all they appear to be doing is acquiescing to the dubious charges imposed on them by saying the FCO won't get involved in the legal system of another state, despite those legal systems being grossly and so obviously unfair. And this is an argument, Mr. Flello, that I'm very, very familiar with, all too familiar with in relation to a constituency case, that of Neil Dewar, whose parents believe was murdered by Brazilian police in a Brazilian police station. Now, what we've had, what I think, if we were to get just one official public statement from our Prime Minister unequivocally calling for Andy and Nazanin's release and the release of other British nationals imprisoned unlawfully abroad, I believe that would convince the public that our government will stand up for its citizens and send a strong and unequivocal message to those foreign governments. So my call is for the Prime Minister, the government and perhaps the Minister today to give Andy and Nazanin's families some seasonal comfort over the next week, pick up the phone, issue a statement and call for their release.
Is that this House has considered the case of Andy Tsay and other UK nationals imprisoned abroad. Fiona Bruce.